Hello students. Today I am going to read a very easy, interesting and enjoyable story to you. The name of the story is A Face in the Dark and the story has been written by Ruskin Bond. This story is a supernatural story and the writer makes the supernatural look natural by his artistic skills. Let us first read about Ruskin Bond. Ruskin Bond, an Indian author of British descent, is a prolific writer whose works are popular with adults and children alike. The word prolific here means highly productive writer. In the following story, writer Ruskin Bond relates a thrilling incident set among the picturesque hills around Shimla. Picturesque means beautiful to look at. Ruskin Bond's fascination with the paranormal finds expression in this macabre tale. Paranormal means that cannot be explained through science, and macabre means disturbing or gruesome. Now, what happens in the story? Mr. Oliver, a school teacher, is on his way to school late one night when he meets a strange young boy. The encounter fills him with terror and he takes to his heels. Takes to his heels means he runs very fast, only to discover that there is no escape for him. So he runs very fast, but later he discovers that he cannot be saved now. Ruskin Bond makes skillful use of all the elements of a horror story: fear, surprise, suspense, and mystery to explore humanity's collective fascination with the dark. Like human beings have always been fascinated with the dark. So, human beings have always enjoyed listening to stories about ghosts and monsters and other things. Not only have they enjoyed listening to stories, there are many people who enjoyed dabbling in these things. Now, let us begin the story. Mr. Oliver, an Anglo Indian teacher, was returning to his school late one night on the outskirts of hill station of Shimla. So Mr. Oliver, who was an Anglo Indian teacher, Anglo Indian means he was of mixed British and Indian parentage. Like one of his parents was British and one was Indian. So he was returning to his school late one night, and the school was on the outskirts of hill station of Shimla. Outskirts means outer part of the town that was away from the center of the town. From before Kipling's time, the school had been run on English public school lines, and the boys, most of them from wealthy Indian families, wore blazers, caps, and ties. From before Kipling's time, Kipling here refers to Rudyard Kipling, who was the writer of the Jungle Book. The school had been run on English public school line. English public school line means the school belonged to the elite schools there. And boys who studied in that school, most of them they belonged to very wealthy Indian families because they wore blazers, caps and ties. So it is compared with those schools in those times, the government schools, where most of the children they belonged to the poor families and they could not afford these good clothes. So all the boys who studied in that school, they belonged to Indian families because they wore blazers, caps and ties. Life magazine, in a feature on India, had once called it the Eton of the East. So, Life magazine, which is a very famous magazine in Britain, that magazine, in its feature on India, had referred the school as the Eton of the East. So, Eton of the East here refers to the college there in England, which is basically meant for boys only. It is a very famous college there. So this school has been compared with that college in East because it had all the features, it had all the characteristics which were there in Britain. Mr. Oliver had been teaching in the school for several years. So Mr. Oliver, he had been teaching in the school for several years. The Shimla Bazaar, with its cinemas and restaurants, was about 3 miles from the school, and Mr. Oliver, a bachelor, usually strolled into the town in the evening, returning after dark, when he would take a shortcut through the pine forest. So the Shimla Bazaar, it had all the cinemas and all the restaurants, and it was about 3 miles away from the school. And Mr. Oliver, he was a bachelor. Bachelor means he was an unmarried man. So he usually strolled into, strolled means he would go for a walk into the town in the evening, and he would return from there after dark. And when he would return, he would take a shortcut through the pine forest. Like he will not take the main road, he would come through the shortcut. When there was a strong wind, the pine trees made sad, eerie sounds that kept most of the people to the main road. So, in the evenings, when there would be strong winds blowing there, and because of the winds, these pine trees they would make sad, eerie sounds. Eerie means very strange, very mysterious, and frightening sounds, and because of which most of the people they avoided the shortcut and they would use the main road to return. But Mr. Oliver was not a nervous or imaginative man. But Mr. Oliver, he was not a nervous man, like he would not overthink anything. So he would take the shortcut. He carried a torch and its gleam, the batteries were running down, moved pitifully down the narrow forest path. So this day, when Mr. Oliver he was returning and he was carrying a torch, like he was an educated man and he was an intelligent man, he would use his common sense that when he would return in the evening, it would be dark and he would need a torch. So he would carry a torch and the gleam, the light of the torch, since the batteries were running down, the batteries were running low. That is why the light was not very bright. So he moved fitfully down the narrow forest path. When its flickering light fell in the figure of a boy who was sitting alone on a rock. So that day, when Mr. Oliver was returning to his school, carrying his dim torch, the light fell on the figure of a boy who was sitting alone on a rock. Mr. Oliver stopped. So, being a teacher, when he saw a student of his school sitting there in the dark, Mr. Oliver stopped. Boys were not supposed to be out after dark. So, the boys of that school, they were not allowed to come out of the school after dark. "What are you doing out there, boy?" asked Mr. Oliver sharply, moving closer so that he could recognize the miscreant. So, Mr. Oliver, being a teacher, he was really concerned about this boy and he asked the boy what he was doing there. So he was little bit sharp, he was little bit strict there. And so he asked the boy what he was doing there. And he went closer to the boy so that he could recognize the miscreant, so that he could recognize this person, this boy who is not following the rules. Miscreant is a person who has done something wrong or who is not following the rules which are set up. But even as he approached the boy, Mr. Oliver sensed that something was wrong. Though Mr. Oliver went closer to the boy, he found that there is something wrong. The boy appeared to be crying. His head hung down. He held his face in his hands. So the boy was crying, holding his face in his hands. And his body shook convulsively. So the body of the boy, it was violently shaking. Convulsively means violently it was shaking. It was a strange, soundless weeping, and Mr. Oliver felt distinctly uneasy. So the crying of the boy was soundless and it was strange also, and Mr. Oliver felt distinctly uneasy. Distinctly means very clearly he felt uneasy. "Well, what's the matter?" he asked, his anger giving way to concern. So now Mr. Oliver got a little bit concerned about his student and he asked his student, like, "What is the matter? Why are you sitting here in the dark? What are you crying for?" The boy would not answer or look up. Mr. Oliver asked him, but the boy did not look up and he did not reply to his teacher. His body continued to be racked with silent sobbing. So the body of the boy continuously it was racking. Racking means it was continuously shaking with sobbing. The boy was sobbing. "Come on, boy, you shouldn't be out here at this hour." So the teacher now became little bit concerned about the child, and then he started telling him that he should not be out at this hour in the dark. "Tell me the trouble. Look up." So he asked the boy to look up. The boy looked up. He took his hands from his face and looked up at his teacher. So the boy removed his hands from his face and looked up at his teacher, that is Mr. Oliver. The light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, if you could call it a face. So the light, that dim light of Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, if really we could call it a face. Like, why we cannot call it a face? Because it had no eyes, ears, nose, or mouth. The face of the boy could not be called a face because it did not have any eyes, ears, or nose. That means the face of the boy had no physical features. It had no features on the face, and that is why it was difficult to call it a face. It was just a round, smooth head with a school cap on top of it. And that's where the story should end. I mean, that is where there the story would have ended. But for Mr. Oliver, it did not end here. The story did not end here only when Mr. Oliver saw the featureless face of a student. The torch fell from his trembling hands, and the torch of Mr. Oliver, because he got frightened, his hands started trembling and the torch fell down. He turned and scrambled down the path, running blindly through the trees and calling for help. So as soon as Mr. Oliver saw this faceless boy, he started trembling and the torch fell down. And then he turned and scrambled down the path. He scrambled down means he moved very quickly down the path, running blindly through the trees and calling for help. He got frightened and he started running. He started walking quickly and running blindly, and he wanted someone to help him. He was still running towards the school building when he saw a lantern swinging in the middle of the path. So as he was running, he saw that in the middle of the path a lantern was swinging. Mr. Oliver stumbled up to the watchman, gasping for breath. So Mr. Oliver collided, like he stumbled up means he just collided with the watchman there, and he was gasping for breath. He was gasping for breath means he was trying to breathe in a very uneasy way. He was trying to breathe very fast. "What is it, Sahib?" asked the watchman. So the watchman there asked him, "What is it? Why are you running? Has there been an accident? Why are you running?" "I saw something horrible, a boy weeping in the forest, and he had no face." So Mr. Oliver, who was frightened, so he informed this watchman that he had seen something very horrible. And he told the watchman that there was a boy who was weeping in the forest, and this boy had no face. So Mr. Oliver expressed his fear to this watchman. Then the watchman asked, "No face, Sahib? No eyes, nose, mouth, nothing?" And Mr. Oliver replied, "No, that face had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, nothing." "Do you mean it was like this, Sahib?" asked the watchman and raised the lamp to his face. So the watchman there asked Mr. Oliver, "Do you mean that face was like this, Sahib?" And then the watchman raised the lamp to his own face. The watchman asked Mr. Oliver if the face did not have any feature like this, and then he raised the lamp to his own face. The watchman had no eyes, no ears, no features at all, not even an eyebrow. So the watchman also did not have any feature on his face. He did not have any eyes, he did not have any ears, no features on his face, not even an eyebrow. And that's when the wind blew the lamp out, and that point the wind blew and the lamp went out. The lamp which the watchman was carrying, its light went out. So this is how the story ends. So the writer has left it upon the reader to decide, to make out what happens later. If Mr. Oliver died of fright, like the wind blew the lamp out, means Mr. Oliver died of fright, or there was a total darkness after the light went out, the lantern. The wind blew out the lantern. So this is left up to the readers to imagine what we want to see, or what we want to imagine, what we want to find out after the story has ended here.